The previous couple of sessions. My name is, or for those of you who haven't seen the previous couple of sessions, my name is Colin Bowern. I'm an ASP.NET MVP, and I work with the web all day. It's something we eat, sleep, and breathe as we build and manage online communities for rock stars. The environment in which we're in today with Windows Server 2007 or 2008 and IIS 7, as again you probably have heard me mention, this is the primary driver behind Windows Server 2008 sales, and it's there's a lot of reasons behind it. If you've been to the previous sessions, you've seen some of the great features from both a development perspective, but as well an operational perspective that are making IIS 7 a fairly monumental release amongst all of its previous releases. I mean, IIS 6 was great in terms of locking things down from a security perspective, and they did well not ever having any sort of critical vulnerability patches released. But IIS 7 really opens up the field in terms of new functionality, and so you're going to see, I'm hoping that you're taking away from this session a drive to go to IIS 7 and to push your businesses there. Not because, I'm not a Microsoft guy, I don't care about licensing sales and stuff like that. It's purely about the features and functionality that are going to make your lives easier, that are going to make your IT professionals who are operating the environment which you're deploying to a whole lot easier. So it's really about making everybody's lives a whole lot easier and also opening up a bunch of new opportunity. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it takes to get to IIS 7. Oops. Skipping ahead to the review. A lot of what's happening today, if you're in ASP.NET 2.0, the major thing is a bunch of just configuration changes, and you've got to just understand how the new configuration model impacts your potential application. But what they've done is they've also said, hey, we know that there are going to be some crossover apps for some time, so you'll be deploying to both IIS 6 and 7, and so they've facilitated the ability to support both within the same web config, and it saves you from having to do all kinds of one-off deployments or make some crazy modifications just to support both environments. We'll talk a little bit about what it means to stay with the classic pipeline, some of the effects of doing that, some of the gotchas, and then we'll talk about moving to integrated pipeline, which is really the ultimate destination to take full advantage of the IIS 7 features and functionality that you'll want to go. So a quick review of the architectural side of things and why this release is kind of really started to push us in the right direction in terms of where we need to go. First off, the configurations become all XML based, a .config file leveraging the same concepts that we've seen in ASP.NET 2.0. And this is a really important thing from a deployment perspective because it means I'm no longer using all these proprietary tools to edit the metabase as it exists in IIS 6. I can just edit an XML file and do an easy copy or a backup or manipulate it with any of the XML tools out there. The underlying service itself has shifted where it's broken out some of the more generic request handling concepts into Windows Process Activation Service and then implemented on top of that the web core. And what you're going to see over time is things like the FTP service sits and borrows from the same model. So instead of the FTP guys rewriting the wheel, they've just said, they've gotten together with the web guys and said, well, what's similar about FTP and web? Well, we both handle requests. We both have a chance of failing because something in our application goes wrong, so we need some sort of health and monitoring and stuff like that. And all those kind of common bits ended up in this Windows Process Activation Service. Don't be surprised if you see Windows Media Services as well moving to be a WAS-based service. If you're building services today on whether it be web services or .NET remoting services, WAS is absolutely something you need to take a look at. It's there in Windows Vista and Windows Server 2008. And it's certainly the way to go as far as service hosting. And it's definitely what the IIS team did. The other thing was the worker process, and that's something that we've seen in IIS 6. If you're still on 5 and 5.1, this really is encapsulating the process and the application domains that your application runs inside a single process in memory. So if your application falls over, it's not going to take down the entire web server. It's simply going to restart itself and start right back up and continue to service requests. And so all of the bits and pieces are baked inside the worker process in terms of the necessary modules and handlers to service that particular request. So some really, again, a nice clean picture as far as the whole model goes. The distributed configuration idea, this was again, this is a bit of a review if you've been to a few of my sessions in the sense that what I really wanted to get out here was to say that the configuration model has changed, but again, if you're a .NET developer, this is very familiar. You already do web configs today. They've simply borrowed a lot of that notion and boiled it up to the application host. Where they went a little above and beyond, though, is they packed on this idea of schema to be able to say, we're going to enforce some level of validation, and in turn, it's also going to enable our management tools to manage your custom application. So as you're building a custom set of configuration sections, you can actually now manage those configuration sections through the command line tools, the WMI providers, and all the other elements that are baked into IIS today. And that's something we didn't have in IIS 6, because IIS 6 knew nothing really about ASP.NET. As far as IIS 6 was concerned, it was just an ASAPI plugin filter, and that was it. Now IIS absolutely knows about ASP.NET and builds upon a lot of those concepts. One of the other really strong things, as I was just kind of talking about, was that management framework. So as you're building out and deploying your application, you've got multiple routes to get in and configure your application. So if you want to build in a GUI like configuration wizard, and this is not unlike, let's say, BizTalk or Commerce Server, you can do that, but you don't have to worry about writing all kinds of plumbing code to go and modify the configuration. You can simply hook up to the APIs or use the tools. So I think that's a fairly important piece. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the bits that in the configuration file that are of interest, or kind of what's different in a little more detail. So I'm just going to pop open a file here. I'm hoping my virtual machine booted. So there's a new, oops, not System 32. Under your System 32, there's a folder called iNet SRV, and inside it, that's been there for some versions now, but there's a new folder called Config. Config holds both your schemas and the various types of configurations. To give you a quick rundown on what they are, you've got application hosts, and that really defines your sites at the server level and your application tools. You've got administration.config, and those are really where all the snap-ins are as you extend the IIS manager. It says, hey, if you're looking for this section, load this management interface, and you can manage that section. And the redirection.config is used for web farms. It says, if you need web configs for this site, go to this UNC path, and you can pull up the web configs for that. The one that we're really interested in right now is the application host.config. So let's go ahead and load that up here. It's going to chew away for a second. I'm going to go to full screen. It really looks like an ASP.NET web config, and that's actually a really good thing, because it means from an ASP.NET perspective, it's very easy to migrate to IIS 7 and take along a lot of the concepts and knowledge that you already share today. And so that idea of sections and section groups and all of that stuff, that all exists. And they're also following this whole system dot notion. So system.web server, system.ftp server follow along that notion of naming convention. They've gone ahead and in system.application host, this is really that main definition of the various applications you have. You can see it's just using standard add remove collections. So if I want to get rid of an application pool, I can just go ahead and delete it and save the file, and I'm done. If I want to go in and add some different sites, I can just simply cut and paste and add a site element. They're also building in a notion of compatibility for custom metadata elements. And this is that whole backwards compatibility thing. So if you're in IIS 5 or IIS 6 and you're doing stuff in the metabase, and I haven't really run into a lot of people who have, but they certainly are out there, they've built in this thing called the ABO mapper. And what essentially it's doing is it's intercepting these calls that would traditionally go to IIS 6 APIs and then translating that through to a bunch of XML elements where it can actually store the values. And it's, of course, defining that here in XML so that you know where exactly everything is. So you've got that backwards compatibility from a metabase perspective. It is a translation layer, so kind of the emphasis there is it's there for backwards compatibility, but you should try and move off of it as soon as possible. So if you want to look for, hey, I've just moved my app to IIS 7, what are my next steps? Well, anywhere where you're doing a compatibility or backwards compat thing, that's where you want to start addressing first, because you're actually spending a little more in terms of performance because it's got to do some sort of translation or mapping. talking about opportunities here, IIS is built on a somewhat of a generic infrastructure in that you can actually add other listeners on top. And this is where I said, don't be surprised if you see Windows Media Services moving on top of IIS, or at least the infrastructure left by IIS. They've actually left a big clue in saying listener adapter HTTP. Well, it's not too far to say listener adapter add WMS or RTSP and start building adapters for different protocols there. Within the site definition, you'll find, again, it's the same sort of thing. It's a fairly straightforward, here's my site, here's where it starts, and here are a few bindings to a bunch of ports out there. It's fairly basic sets of definition, but again, to do this under IIS 6 was a real pain in terms of running all kinds of command line tools or going through the GUI. Now I can cut and paste it. From an application migration perspective, what this actually, the opportunity here is to sit there and verify all the settings within any given site. Under IIS 6, if you had to verify if a site was set up properly or your application was configured properly, it was actually quite a laborious process. A lot of people just resulted to going into the GUI and taking screenshots of the GUI and say, make sure this dialog looks like this. Now, as you move to IIS 7, you can just turn around and have people review the contents of the XML, or just do an XML diff with something like WinMerge. The other net new section, you'll see this actually pop up in your web configs as you move to IIS 7, and we'll show you some nifty tools to get there. The system.web server, and this is really where all the web server type functionality that might be specific to the various modules will exist. So you got things like, these are the modules defined for at the server level, HTTP compression settings, error settings, logging, redirects, etc. This is really This is really where the site functionality is configured. So this stuff is actually all just defaults. As you go to actually drive into your web config, you can override any of these parameters and make it specific to your configuration. And this is actually what's really appealing to, again, IIS 6 and back developers in my mind, is that idea that I no longer have to instruct people to start going through properties panels on how to configure my application, or write something that uses ADS util, or go in and try and hack the metabase. I can simply package this up as part of my web config and distribute it with my application. So it ensures, as I move from development to test to production, that the settings that IIS uses are exactly the same. There's no more, oops, I forgot to check a box, and that's why my production application was acting a little squirrely. So all these settings are stuff that, again, traditionally existed in the metabase. They're now all sitting here in the configuration file and can be overridden through the web.config. And I think that's quite a big leap in terms of the overall power of this element. The other thing as well is that you get all these settings in terms of the location tags. So you can say, change the IIS behavior for this folder. And a great example was require SSL. Let's say you had a folder that had all your login pages. In the past in ASP.NET, you'd end up writing a whole bunch of code to detect, hey, does this have HTTPS, if not redirect, or you'd require somebody going into the metabase and just checking the box. Well, if they forgot and it didn't enforce SSL, you'd have potentially an open security breach. Here you'd just bake it right into the web config as well, do a location path /account/login.aspx and require SSL. So I think the portability of settings is a pretty key part of what makes IIS 7 a really great move as far as being able to deploy from development to test to production. And again, today, if you're working on Windows Vista, you have IIS 7. So if you want to talk about developing on something that's going to leverage these features, it's there out of the box. So that's kind of one of those appeals of the fact that they actually baked IIS 7 right into the operating system at an early stage. So that's the kind of main configuration change. We're actually going to drill into some of them as we look at migrating an actual application. One of the things that you may be wondering, though, is, hey, all this stuff has been defined in the configuration file. What about my handlers and modules? And in particular, I've written some custom modules in ASP.NET or handlers. How do those map up to the server level, especially as I look to go to integrated mode? Well, they've thought about that. They've in IIS 7, once you're in integrated mode, your handlers and modulars are defined in system.web server. And what it actually does under the covers, it says, hey, if I'm in integrated mode, I'm just going to actually ignore what ASP.NET has in system.web. Now, to actually make it ignore it and work, there's a small attribute that you have to set, because they do some validation to say, oh, looks like an IIS 6 application, but you're running in integrated mode. Are you sure? And so you've just got to go set a particular attribute to false for that to really work. But what's neat about this is you can take your IIS or your app and deploy to 6 and 7 and not have to worry about changing the configuration. Now with 6, of course, if you've got meta-based stuff, you still have to do all of that. But you can bake those two side by side. And the same really goes with every other system.web server setting. So you can deploy to both environments with the same web config and not have to worry about any sort of version conflicts and stuff like that. IIS 6 will just simply look at system.web servers, go, I don't know what it is, and ignore it and move on. So that's a really great kind of cross-deployment story, especially if you're doing packaged product and you're deploying out to the web in general and you want to be able to support both environments. Feel free to bake both configuration values right into the same web config. As we look at the pipelines, though, this is one of those kind of big moves. One of the big advantages of the integrated pipeline is the performance and the full fidelity access to everything that's going on in IIS. Back in classic mode, ASP.NET was simply an ASAPI handler that would execute midway down IIS's pipeline and then repeat a lot of actions like authentication and authorization for its own purposes. And this was actually quite, inefficient as far as things go, but it was the only way they could bake ASP.NET into IIS 6, which was already well designed before they really shipped ASP.NET 2.0. So what you get with the integrated mode is the ability to now interface anywhere within the pipeline. You're no longer running off execute handler. You actually have full fidelity access into here. And from a migration perspective, this opens up a whole bunch of opportunity. And there's actually not a whole lot to get to IIS 7 as far as plugging into these modules. If you've written your module and your handler and haven't done anything too funky in the sense of sparking up events or connecting to events in the middle of other request functions, you'll actually be able to plug into integrated mode quite easily. And we'll move an application live here to the integrated mode, an old ASP.NET 1.1 application. Like I said, in classic mode, this was kind of how things worked, where ASP.NET would process inside the handler, then say, oh, it's ASP.NET, branch off through the ASAPI filter, and start the whole process over again. Just incredibly inefficient, but really, ultimately, they were doing exactly the same thing, so they merged that as part of the integrated mode. So things to know, classic is really there to help you migrate. But I wouldn't plan on classic. Don't make it your default strategy. Actually test going to integrated mode and see if you can make that switch. Because classic really is I can totally see in another release or two's time it's going to be deprecated. So classic's one of those, hey, I've got production applications, there's a blocker stopping me from going to integrated. That's how I'm going to get my customers and my users up onto IIS 7 today. However, you should be planning within a release or two to get off classic mode and get to integrated mode. And they worked really hard to reduce a lot of the barriers. That being said, there are a bunch of gotchas, and there's too much to go through here in the scope of an hour. A lot of little things, and there are absolutely known workarounds for most of them. So if you go to the shrinkster.com/xx8, it's a great blog post by one of the IIS guys that simply enumerates about 30 or 40 different little gotchas that you have to be aware of. And again, you can look at them and evaluate how much work do you want to invest in to be able to support integrated right out of the gate, or do you want to support classic for this first jump and then go to integrated. My advice, though, get off classic as quickly as you can. So let's see what it's like to deploy an app to IIS 7 and get it all converted. So I'm going to pull up my my web browser here and pop open the Community Starter Kit. I still have my transport security module in from one of the previous demos. So I'll just hit continue on that. So this is an ASP.NET 1.1 app. It came out years ago. It's sitting in the archived section of ASP.NET/download. So it really has never, it's never even seen IIS 7 prior to this. let alone ASP.NET 2.0. It's got custom handlers and modules inside of it, and it does, it's a 32-bit only app and all of that stuff. Oops, my SQL server's, I got to start my SQL server, of course, for it to work. Let's just go do that. So, it's a pretty common app in the sense that it does database access and, tries to do a few little things above and beyond your typical app in the sense that it does JPEG handling and GIF handling and all that stuff. So they've gone and put together this app, and it's certainly, like I say, an old one, but you'll find here over this next little bit here as we pull it up and convert it over, there's not a lot to get it running, but I will take you through some of the gotchas. So all I've simply done is install the app and run through its configuration wizard, and this is what I get. First off, like right out of the gate, you notice it's pretty much working. Now, there's a few gotchas here that I've got to make some changes to, and we'll walk through those in a second. You'll notice images are broken. It is running under .NET 2.0, which actually there was a great question in my last session about some issues where they were, they couldn't go to 2.0 because some of the functionality was deprecated. So we really ought to have it go back to 1.1 for the sake of getting this application going up until we can validate that it can run on the 2.0 runtime. So this is the app out of the box, and so we got to fix a few of those kind of broken things. So let's pull up IIS Manager here, and let's connect to our server and take a look at the configuration. So I'm going to go into my site, and this time I've just got it off a virtual directory for simplicity. Right out of the gate, let's go into the manage the application properties, and we'll see it's using the classic.NET app pool. When we click on the classic.NET app pool, you can see right here it's running the .NET Framework 2.0 and it's in pipeline classic mode. Remember, this was an app built for 1.1. When you install 1.1 on the server, it's going to do a few things for you. It's actually going to go ahead and create an ASP.NET 1.1 application pool, and when you go ahead and edit the basic settings of it, it's actually going to recognize that it's 1.1. So the framework by default doesn't ship with Windows Server 2008 for 1.1, and it's something that you simply have to go and pull the download for. If you're going to install 1.1 on Server 2008, make sure you get the latest service packs and hotfixes and all that stuff. But when you install it, they've already done the work saying, hey, we know people might install 1.1, so we're going to build in some intelligence to look for it and handle it appropriately. So I've got the 1.1 framework, but we're just going to continue along on 2.0, just for kicks, Like, why go back to 1.1 if I don't have to? And let's take a look at what some of the next steps are. So when I go and look at what's going on here, let's go ahead and take a look at some of these broken images and find out why they're broken. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up this image URL here and open it. I'm going to get a 404 file not bound. Oh, well, that's kind of interesting. Why is that file not bound? Let's go ahead and take a look at what's happening inside the community starter kit in terms of the web config here. So let's go ahead and switch to content view, which I'll open up in Visual Studio so it's easier to see. Actually, not. So this is the web config for it. As you can see, it's probably a typical application. It's got a custom section in it that does a bunch of configuration pieces. It's got some typical ASP.NET stuff for connecting up to modules, a few handlers, and some web services. And oh, look, web servers already started to do some kind of custom mapping and pick it up as I've installed the application. It started to pick up a few things out of the gate, but those aren't relevant just yet. We'll come back to those. But it looks like your typical ASP.NET 1x, 2x web application. So far, it seems to be working. But we're looking here, and I look at the handlers here, and I say, hey, there's JPEG and GIF handlers. Why the heck isn't that working? Well, right out of the gate, they've got their own custom handler module, and we know IIS 7 wants to run through the integrated pipeline and handle this. one of the things that is missing out of this, and this was something that was part of the documentation, is in IIS 6, you had to add a custom wildcard handler that said, for GIF or JPEG or whatever, you've actually got to map that through the ASP.NET ASAPI filter. Because what's happening in IIS 6 or IIS 7 in classic mode, it will send ASP.NET pages through the ASP.NET stuff, but it will not send GIF or JPEG files through. Even though I've got a handler defined, it's because the IIS 7 in classic mode doesn't route it through the ASP.NET framework. And that's not unlike IIS 6, but just to show you, the same behavior exists when you're in classic mode in 6 and in 7. So one of those configuration steps that this needed was for me to go into the handlers, and this is exactly, this is a similar process to what I would have done in IIS 6, and add a wildcard handler mapping. So there's this thing over here at the task pane that says add wildcard handler script map, and it's going to say for anything that you don't have a specific handler for, send it to somewhere. So we're going to send it to the ASP.NET 2 process. So Windows, Microsoft, .NET, Framework, the 2.0.50 727, ASP.NET _ASAPI.dll. And this is, I'll just call it wildcard. And then it's going to prompt me and say, hey, you're adding an ASAPI extension. Do you want to make sure that's allowed? That concept of web service extensions and allowing or disabling them, that carried over into 7. That exists here as well. So let's go ahead and say yes, because we definitely want to make sure it allowed. And if we scroll down, there's our wildcard mapping there at the bottom. And now that's defined. So what that says now is, again, exactly similar to IIS 6, is that if you get anything that you don't have a specific handler for, send it through the ASP.NET process. And as a result, it should process that handler section now that was in the web config that we saw before. So again, similar behavior is when you're in classic mode that you should pay attention to. When we move to integrated mode, we'll be able to get rid of that wildcard mapping because the integrated mode runs the full and picks up on all the handlers as part of the project. So let's go ahead and take a look at our page now that we've got that one handler mapping. And if I do a refresh here, I see I still have a few other broken things that I have to pay attention to here. So I've got some of my images, but hey, what the heck, why not all of them? Let's go ahead and right-click on them, and let's copy the entire URL and post that to the page. And I've got these wonderful detailed error messages that are really helping me out. In this case, it's actually request filtering denying the request. So the request is actually valid, but the request filtering is saying, no, you can't do double escaping in the URL. And this is something that if you were in IIS 6 and you had URL scan involved, you probably would have already hit an error like this and taken care of it. In IIS 7, that URL scan functionality is in there in IIS and turned on by default. So as you migrate your applications, if you've got really long query strings, if you've got funky stuff in your query strings like double escaping, you're going to hit some of these turned on by default security functionality. So it's important, even though you're using classic mode, you're still going to have to test your application and find out what the result of all these on by default security settings are going to have on your application. So in this case, we're going to say, hey, we think the application behaved well and it knows about double unescaped stuff, so we're going to turn that off as far as being watched for. As soon as my UI becomes responsive here. All right, when all else fails, start another one. Oh, there it goes. Let's go ahead and switch back to the features view here. Let's go to the request filtering section. So that's here, up here in HTTP features here. And again, request filtering something as well that's a module that you can choose even just not to install altogether. That being said, don't fight against security features. Please, whatever you do, just understand what exactly the concern is. Make sure you address the concern, or you turn it off, acknowledging that you understand the consequences of turning that off. When people go and turn off security features and not really understand how it's doing, it scares me because you're opening an attack vector, especially if you're, well, actually, both if you're doing public web applications, even if you're doing internal web applications. The way we're seeing, a lot of the phishing and the viruses get around today, inside the corporate environment is actually just as scary as coding for the public internet. So please don't turn off security features unless you understand the impact. So just a quick brief walkthrough. You can deny file extensions. You can look for hidden pieces of code in there and deny that. You can deny certain URL sequences and only allow certain HTTP verbs. This is actually one of those things. Did you know there's like 30 HTTP verbs? Like there's get, put, post, and a whole bunch of other ones. For the most part, most of our web applications, get and post, satisfies pretty much everything. So you ought to consider just saying, hey, my application only allows get and post to work. For some reason I'm timing out here. Oh, no, it came back. All right. So let's go ahead and edit the settings. So this is some of the request filtering settings that are just general settings. There's that allow double escaping. We're going to hit OK, but before we get out of here, maximum URL length, maximum query string length. Be aware again if you're moving to IIS 7 from IIS 6 and prior, and you didn't have URL scan involved, those limits are new to you. And especially if you're baking on things like session IDs and stuff into the query string, you'll hit 2K potentially quite easily depending on what you have in there. So just be aware of that. The guys at maps.live.com, if you ever sent a map link, you get a link that's like this big. I think they've turned this off or at least expanded it because they give you really, really big links. So let's go back to our page here. So I've turned that off, do a Control F5, and now I get my image. So you can see there that actually took a human eye because there was no error message that came up in that. My page actually rendered just fine from an error handling perspective. IIS just nuked that. So one of the other places you want to watch as you're testing is the log files to see are there any of those 404 with substatus code errors. If you're seeing any of those sorts of errors, that would have only showed up in the IIS log. That actually wouldn't have been an event in the event viewer or anything like that. So as you're testing your application, you have to make sure not only does it function, but you should review the IIS activity logs to see if you're getting anything other than 200 OKs back or 302 redirects if you use redirects. So make sure you review the IIS logs as part of your entire process. Sometimes though, you will need to go ahead and port back an app that uses an old COM object as well. And so there's a few other elements that can come into play as well with those. ASP.NET was notorious for not having a 64-bit version of any of its stuff. And so you can go ahead and set IIS, the worker process, to only run in 32-bit mode. And as I think about I don't think that's actually there in the GUI as of yet. So let's go ahead back to the application host. So if you've got applications that use old COM objects, and COM is absolutely one of those where you'll run into it, as you're defining this, you can go ahead and add in some bitness pieces, like enable 32-bit apps on Win64, so you can run those 32-bit applications within a 64-bit environment, and IIS will automatically run it in 32-bit mode. One of the great new things about IIS 7 is you can do 64 and 32 side by side on the same server. No need to deploy multiple servers. So if your server is capable of x64, my advice, absolutely, as you're upgrading to Windows Server 2008, x64 all the way. It's where all the servers are going. Everything is going to take advantage of it. From a .NET perspective, you'll see things like the parallel framework and a bunch of other things that take full advantage of those processors and the multiple cores and everything else. So please definitely consider that. So manage runtime equals v11, and then manage pipeline mode equals classic. So these are just basically the settings that you need to enforce on 1.1. All right. So let's talk a little bit about moving to integrated mode. There's a couple of things that you need to know. First off, if you have no modules or handlers, chances are you can actually just go straight to integrated mode. You can probably skip Classic and go straight there. Because remember, the big thing that's changing between Classic and integrated is how IIS processes that entire stack from top to bottom when a request comes in. So if you've written just a regular app that's got an ASPX page that does stuff, chances are you can just go straight to integrated mode. So just skip Classic altogether and go straight to integrated mode. Of course, whether you go Classic or integrated, you have to test those security features anyways. When you do make that move, though, you're going to have to move everything to system.web server. And there's a nifty little tool that I'll show you in a second that actually does all the heavy lifting for you around that. Once you get to integrated mode, you've got a bunch of new things that are available to you as part of the HTTP stack, because we've now got full fidelity with the IIS processing stack. And so you want to be able to look for opportunities to get rid of potentially hacky code that you've written before to get around some of these features. In particular, what's of interest is some of the server variables and the response stuff where, because of where we executed before in Classic mode, we were just too we were too late in the process to be able to influence these things. So, I've got access to the headers collection. I can actually start writing data to it. And that's actually a really useful thing on certain processes, especially if you want to influence the client in some fashion or another. If your module does have some restrictions, though, again, you can go ahead and enforce those restrictions with those preconditions. So kind of similar to the app pool, how I had those things that said, hey, this runs in 1.1 or it runs as 32-bit. When you define a module, you can actually enforce those conditions there as well. So the module and the application will only run if the app pool is running in 32-bit mode. And IIS simply just reads down and does a calculation. Is there anybody that says 32-bit, then 64-bit? Oh, now I'm going to throw an error because I don't know which way to go. If people only say precondition is 32-bit and then everything else is left undecided, the process will launch as a 32-bit process. So it does some calculation there based on these preconditions. So if you've got some restrictions in your modules and handlers, you can get those out there. Again, I would try and not do that if you don't have to. So let's go ahead and make a move to the integrated platform. Let's pop open my command prompt. So I'm going to go ahead and do a remote call again. For those who have been here, they've seen that I'm a big fan of not running on the web server. So I simply use Windows Remote Shell, do a connection to my web server, log in, and pass some commands along. It's a really neat idea, and it's that idea that most servers limit you to 2 connections for RDP connections. So let's do a remote server call. We're going to go to the Windows System 32/inetserv and pop open app command and just do a /? Here to start with. What we get here is there's a neat little command that you actually have here as part of the config. So let's go here and do config /? And you'll notice here right at the bottom it says migrate. Migrate a legacy configuration section forward. So they know as we migrate from 6 to 7, all our ASP.NET apps have these handlers and modules, and instead of us trying to figure out the configuration settings, we can just simply point that configuration, say migrate, migrate config, and then pass it the path. So let's do default website /community starter kit, and then pass that off. It's going to go ahead and spawn that command remotely, and it's going to migrate the 2 handlers and modules section. So with that in place, let's go ahead and take a look at what it's done to our configuration file. Again, it's one of those things where don't let a tool auto-magically do something. Always inspect afterwards to see what it does so you fully understand the impact. So let's go scroll through our configuration file here again. I've got my custom settings. Everything looks normal there. Nothing's changed. I've got my system.web. Again, everything there looks normal. I still have my handlers there. I still have my modules. But now if I look in System Web Server, they've gone ahead and added a bunch of stuff that I had defined up into the handler section. They've applied forward my request filtering and plugged in my modules and then turned off the flag to say, yeah, it might exist in both places, but that's okay, we've actually gone through it. So it's actually done all the heavy lifting for me to move myself to integrated mode. So let's actually go and give it a whirl and see if it works. We're going to go back to Community Starter Kit here. Let's go ahead and manage the application, go to Advanced Settings, drop it down from my classic application pool, go to my default application pool. So now I'm in 2.0, I'm in integrated mode. I'm going to hit OK. And cross your fingers. It'll take a second to spin up the application mode, and of course it's going to throw one of my old demo things in there. Just let me get rid of that old module, because that no longer exists. Do Control F5, and we're pretty much back there. Now again, we're hitting a few other kind of integrated isms here in terms of our handler, or not our handlers, but our file system in particular. This is just, their handler not interpreting a bunch of things properly. And this is actually now where I have to start digging into the code. And this is where I start to hit a bunch of gotchas around my particular handlers. And it has all to do with how they've coded up the handlers. And let's just talk about a few of those things that once you've made the integration or the move. So first off, you can see, my app generally worked. There still are a few gotchas that need to be worked out. And part of that has to do with when it was coded against ASP.NET 1.1, it did a few things that we had to do in ASP.NET 1.1 because we didn't have that full fidelity pipeline. Let's talk about a few of those things. First off, it's kind of that note again, request filtering is on by default. It will eat you. If you've got any dependencies on some of the functionality like Passport or front page server extensions, those are gone. They're no longer available. NNTP is gone. Sub-authentication is gone. What you should also start prepping for is system.web.mail disappearing. It's not happening in IIS 7, but in the next release, in Windows 7, system.web.mail probably won't be there and fully supported. And that's been coming for some time. Everybody's been telling you move to system.net.mail. So just that's a heads up for the next release to say move off that one. So look at the features you're using and ask, hey, is this an old feature? Is there something new? Another one that you can see that signs of the time, and I can't guarantee it. I don't know what's happening in Windows 7 necessarily, but if you look at SMTP server in IIS 7, it's actually the IIS 6 SMTP server brought forward with a few kind of compat hotfixes on. I would bet that SMTP is going to be gone in the next release as well. So if you're using SMTP server, you want to start looking for alternative options. And there's a bunch of third-party .NET components that have the whole mail queuing and everything built into it. And so you want to start researching SMTP and making that move. It's still there today. You're okay for today. But again, if you're going to go in and do a bunch of these improvements, I'd start moving away from the IIS SMTP service. This is probably what started to break a bunch of my handlers for the most part. First off, begin request actually means begin request. And what I mean by this is that when we were working in ASP.NET 1.1 or 2.0 under IIS 6, we were actually a fair bit down the stack. There were a bunch of things already established that I could actually bet on. There was a request and response object there that I could actually start doing stuff with. In IIS 7 under integrated mode, there's very little there. I don't have my principal defined from a security perspective. I don't have any sort of authorization rules defined. So begin request really is begin request. And this is actually a good thing because I can do certain things that I might otherwise have done later on, and the transport security module we built is a good example. If I want to communicate with my client and I want to ensure that it's HTTPS, I really want to move them to HTTPS as quickly as possible and not waste a lot of time on a conversation I'm just going to ignore anyways because I'm going to redirect. So if you're building URL rewriting modules and stuff like that, begin request has actually made it really easy to do. The application start in the global ASAX file as well does not have request and response objects because application start literally means application has started. The process has just spun up And so we don't even have a request or a response object at that point yet. And again, these are the little things that will cause your application either to break because of a null reference exception, or just cause it to not function fully like those particular handlers did. So be aware of those small little changes. Reevaluate if you do anything within a module or a handler that depends on certain events. Just reevaluate what your dependencies are there and what you're relying on. The other thing as well is that forms and Windows Auth no longer work at the same time. And this is something in classic mode, and in IIS 6 it worked perfectly. And the reason it did is because IIS did all kinds of authentication, and then it handed it off to ASP.NET that did forms authentication. And so Windows was part of IIS and forms was part of ASP.NET, and so you could do that. Now authenticate request is one event, and you can only have one handler or one module pick up on that particular request. So those two won't run one after the other. You can't do authenticate and then authenticate again. So there is a workaround. One of the guys blogged about it, shrinkster.com/xxn, and you can go see how they worked around that. It's some finagling. It's not quite as nice and clean, but it gets there. From an account perspective, if you've been planning on, or if you've been using network service, you should be aware that they're doing SID filters on all the network services accounts. So in the past, when you launched as network service in app 1, and you launched as network service in app 2, and you both accessed a resource ACLed for, or let's say a temp file that was ACLed by network service, you could access them because the underlying security identifier was the same. Well, if you look at process, if you go and dig into the process, you'll see that what they've done is for each instance or each application pool, there's a dynamic component added to the security identifier so that application A and application B are really two different versions of the network service that are running. So in some scenarios, that might catch you. The better solution is just don't use network service. And in fact, there was a vulnerability that came out, I think, last month for DTC and SQL that depended on you using network service. So you just shouldn't use network service to begin with. You should really be using custom identities that you can lock down to your specific needs. The other thing as well is the changing of the guard in terms of the default groups and user accounts. This is kind of net new. It was done for the web farm scenario, and it actually makes life a whole lot easier. So your anonymous user account is now a built-in account, and so you can rely on the security identifier being static from machine to machine to machine. You can also now go and change your scripts. Instead of saying iuser underscore percent computer name percent, you can just call it the iuser or the ISO or iuser account, and it's just a built-in account. There's no underscore computer name because it really didn't serve any purpose in the long run. The IIS Users also replaces IIS Worker Process Group, and you get automatic membership as part of that group as well. So you no longer have to sit there and add accounts to IIS Worker Process Group. That group automatically picks it up. And so when you're out there, again, if you're ACLing your file system based off IIS Worker Process Group, you don't have to worry about doing all the work underneath the covers. One of the things that was brought up, again, it was a great question in the last session. Do not use ASP.NET Reg IIS. It will just only cause you grief and problems because it was built based on IIS 6 in a time long, long ago. So if you're as part of your application deployment process, you're deploying to Windows Server 2008, do not use ASP.NET Reg IIS. ASP.NET is already there. It's already registered. Don't worry about it. Just do not use it. It will cause you worlds of pain. So that's pretty much it. I'm a few minutes ahead again. So any questions about migrations or any scenarios or anything that I can, you'd like to discuss while we got these extra few minutes? No questions? Everybody's going to migrate to IIS 7? Does anybody see any barriers? I'm just curious. Anybody see any barriers within their environments to moving to IIS 7? There? Impersonation. Is there a workaround for impersonation in the integrated mode? Yes, there is. Again, it's not pretty. So the idea is that what they're trying to do is protect the entire pipeline from switching tokens because you're actually now affecting the application pool as a whole, and it could bleed over to multiple requests. If you Google around some of the blogs, a bunch of the guys have figured out some workarounds. So that'd be the, there are workarounds. I don't have all the details off the top of my head, but it's just, it operates differently than it did in classic mode. And it's just because that you're now actually part of the entire IIS execution process. And it's a pure security thing. If they allowed you to do impersonation, you could actually open up a bunch of things where third-party modules could do really bad stuff under the context of that user ID that you didn't intend to. So there are a few workarounds, and they're out there on the blogs. So, yep. Hey.
Then it's ASP, and as well as IIS web application in the VB6 called web classes. How do they migrate into?
So ASP and the old web classes.
Yes.
Good question. It's been years since I've seen an ASP.NET or ASP application. We've been fortunately on the leading edge of ASP.NET stuff. But yeah, it goes into classic mode and runs. There is, unlike, it doesn't actually hook into the handlers or the different modules the same way that ASP.NET does. So those just run in classic mode. It's an ASAPI filter, much like ASP.NET was. So that really hasn't changed a whole lot. Classic ASP absolutely does run. Classic ASP also runs quite nicely on server core. So if you're looking for a lightweight server that runs ASP, you can just launch that off the server core as well. So they just run. You just create an ASP page and execute your code. If you're doing some COM stuff, that's where you're going to have to start looking at your pipelines and enforcing that 32-bit or 64-bit flag, depending on your COM objects that you're calling. That's really the big thing to watch out for. What you do get, though, is you get the ability to mix on this platform. So you can have one app pool running in 32 and another one in 64-bit mode. So let's say you've got an old ASP.NET or old ASP application, you got a new ASP.NET one. You can host both on the same server. I think that's a big plus from an infrastructure cost perspective. So.
And like in classic ASP, like they have like inet info.exe and DLL hosts. They run.
Sorry. In classic ASP, they have
like if you are running a classic ASP and ASP.NET application on a web server, if it's in the task manager, you get the IIS. The ASP runs under DLL host or inet info.exe.
Okay, there is no more inet.
How does it work in IIS? I'm just curious.
So in here, everything spins up in a worker process. So your classic ASP is actually going to launch under a W3 WP process.
Okay.
It no longer operates underneath the inet info. And it was purely a fragility thing to say anything that runs under that core W3 process, if it crashes, it brings down the entire server. So actually, there's another advantage of moving to IIS 7 for ASP applications is you get worker processes right out of the gate. And the same has actually happened. FTP did the same. Every FTP site runs under a worker process. So if an FTP site, I mean, it's really hard to crash an FTP server, but if you manage to do that, it won't bring down your entire server. So yeah, pretty much the core has become the control center, and that's it. There's no web applications that run under the core. So you get stability improvements just by moving. And it shouldn't be a whole lot of compat issues along that route. But again, testing, Server 2008 as a whole has locked down a bunch of COM settings and DCOM settings. So you'll need to just test those to make sure that they work. And that's actually what's holding back a bunch of applications from having Server 2008 support is they just want to test to make sure COM functions. And Commerce Server 2007 is a great example. We'll see support later this year for Server 2008 because they have a bunch of old COM objects that they need to make sure still run under Server 2008.
Okay. Just off track, but like in the complex, we have a complex application. Still ASP2, still enterprise services, which is mostly dependent on a COM kind of registration and all.
Yeah.
So in Windows 2008, are we moving completely a .NET way of registering enterprise services?
So yeah, you can still have COM+. It's still there under Server 2008. So if you're using System Enterprise Services or you're plugging straight into COM+, that's all still there. Again, it's the bitness thing. COM was still 32 or 64-bit. You just got to pay attention to that. But no, you can do System Enterprise Services. All that stuff works as is. Yeah. So those, I wouldn't be concerned about migrating that stuff there. The biggest stuff is modules and handlers. That's your primary concern in making the move. And it has to do with the fact that you now may be executing way earlier than you were before in classic mode.
Okay, thanks.
Great questions. Any other questions or, yeah?
For deploying my applications on IIS 7.0,
Yeah.
Can I use Visual Studio 2005?
Okay, so the question is on Visual, you can use Visual Studio 2005 to deploy to IIS 7. Yes and no. So that front page server extensions, how they're trying to get it to go away, they did actually ship, a third-party vendor shipped front page server extensions for IIS 7. So Visual Studio 5 still thinks of front page being there, so you'll need to install that compatibility module. I would avoid it where possible. What I would actually look towards, there's a tool that just hit beta 1 that shipped on IIS.net called MS Deploy. And it's a solution that's external to Visual Studio for deploying web applications, and it supports IIS 7. They're doing a lot of thinking right now about deployment in particular for web applications. I'm part of one of the deployment advisory councils with the ASP.NET team, trying to figure out how do we actually fix deployment, because there's 5 different tools to do it, and they're completely different, and they're kind of confusing. My advice is if you're thinking about deploying the applications, package it up in an MSI and deploy, look at something like Wix, W-I-X. It's a great little project for doing MSI stuff. It's way better than the Visual Studio Setup project because it doesn't do weird things. So I'd do Wix or build PowerShell scripts or command line parameters using apt command. I generally avoid the deploy command in Visual Studio altogether. It seems to be going away the more and more we talk about it.
And you also mentioned about, in the previous session, enabling trace listeners from page itself. Can it be done from Visual Studio 2005?
So the question is, for the trace listeners, can you add trace listeners while you're working on VSO5?
Using Visual Studio 2005, can I use trace listeners and then again deploy it on IIS 7.0?
So the question is, under Visual Studio 2005, can you deploy trace listeners? Absolutely. It's .NET 2, so you're good to go. Yeah. That's actually, if you look at everything that we went through, they baked it all into the .NET Framework 2 because they were shipping .NET 2 while they were developing Vista, while they're developing the first version or the first major IIS 7 code base there. So they kind of thought ahead, and so as long as you're doing .NET 2, you're good to go, whether it's 05 or 08. My advice is get 08, though. It's way better as far as a development environment. I'll talk about that at my next session. Any other questions? Any other blockers? I'm curious, what type of applications are out there. I mean, we're almost all ASP.NET. We still have a few COM bits in our applications that are causing us great pains, but does anybody else have anything where they kind of look at this and go, wow, this is, there's a few things I'm not sure about? No? So you're all going to move to IIS 7 next week? I'm going to check all your servers. All right, guys. Well, thanks a lot for your time. If you hit blockers, get onto the forums, post, send me mail. I did bring my business card this time for a few of you who asked. Always happy to point you in the right direction and answer some questions. Thanks a lot, folks.